I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to the 100th episode of Hellbent for Horror. Thank you to everyone who stuck it out on this adventure that I started back in 2016. As the Grateful Dead once said, what a long, strange trip it has been. Episode 100 was always something in the distance, kind of like a mountain range you see from your car as you drive towards it. Suddenly, it was upon me, and I spent some time racking my brain trying to figure out what I could do as a celebratory episode. For me, that became a real task. If you've been a long-time listener, it may be apparent to you that I'm a bit of a walking contradiction. I love talking to people about horror films, and I love recommending movies for them to watch, and yet I cannot stand to make top 10 lists or best of lists. I love meeting new and interesting people, but at the same time, I hate really big crowds. And I love to celebrate anniversaries and achievements, just not my own. So I found myself struggling to find an idea for a show that would mark this quote-unquote momentous event, episode 100, correctly. It was much harder than it sounds. Sometimes me trying to write is like trying to wrestle with smoke. I ended up with a long line of half-baked ideas. I had a classic case of overthinking and overcomplicating a simple idea. If you want a simple idea overcomplicated, I am your man. I'm like a walking Allman Brothers album. So what was my solution? Well, I decided to go back to basics, go back to the beginning. I asked myself the question, why did I start doing this in the first place? What the hell possessed me to do this crazy shit? Well, let me pull the curtain back a little and give you some history. Truth be told, I left a very profitable and prestigious career to, well, essentially sit in a room with a microphone and just talk. I wanted to talk about something that really excited me, something I seemed to have endless love and fascination for. In other words, I wanted to start a conversation about horror movies. I did this without knowing anything about podcasting. It was described to me as on-demand radio, and that was as close as my brain could get to understanding the concept. I had no idea who my audience might be, how anyone would find my show, and if anyone would even want to listen to it. And yet, I did it anyway. I quit my job, and I joined this one-man circus. Why? I did it because I was compelled to. Just the thought of doing this became so exciting, it was all I could think about. It gave me a rush, a heavy-duty rush. It was a rush that you can only get from falling in love. It was passion. And passion can make you do crazy things. How crazy? Let me explain how crazy. I had spent a decade in Silicon Valley working in startups. I was surrounded by geniuses who could build things that never existed before, but they couldn't hold a conversation to save their lives. And that's where I came in. Now, I was no genius, but I understood what they did was special, and I was able to translate that into talking points for recruitment. I was able to cut through all that tech babble and focus on the thing I understood, which was their passion for what they do. It was passion that was on the verge of full-out obsession, and I understood that feeling. The pressure at a fast-paced startup was high, and it was a real adrenaline rush. It was exciting, like a gambler's high is exciting. I ended up being really good at it, and my reputation grew. And it was a great job, until one day, it wasn't. I realized that I was spending all of my time, all of my life, talking about other people's passions instead of my own. And I was slowly losing the light. And so, I decided to take desperate measures and follow my own dream. I sound like an entrepreneur right now, don't I? Until I mention that my dream was to start a horror podcast. That's the thing about following your dream. It sounds crazy to everyone except you. Because following your passion has very little to do with logic. It's not even easy to explain why you're passionate about something. But the need to surrender to that excitement, that devotion, comes from something deeper. and something more personal. It starts when we share a piece of ourselves that is not ordinary, a piece of ourselves that is strange and rare and unique. When we choose this path, we freely admit to what we really care about, and we are compelled to share it. The act of sharing your creation is just as important as creating itself. In fact, the secret that my fellow horror fanatics know is that the real joy comes from the act of sharing that love. When we share the thing that we create out of passion, we connect with other people in a deep and personal way. So when all is said and done, I did this for love. And that sharing of what I love is how I keep finding people just like me. Passion doesn't have prestige. It isn't about pedigree, and it may never bring you wealth, but it will bring you riches. Passion elevates just about anything into art, and that creation attracts the people who want it or need it. I call this attraction the sincere pumpkin patch effect. No matter how crazy what you do may seem to the average person, there are people out there who have the same joy for it, and they will be attracted by your sincere love for what you do. It doesn't matter if it's threadbare and it's rickety. If you sincerely love what you're doing, you will find your audience. Maybe not that many of them, but they will come. They will come because they know that fandom saves their souls. Fandom is the engine that pushes us through the challenges of the real world. Fandom shows us that we are not alone in our crazy thoughts and dreams, that there are people just like us out there. And you know what? When you least expect it, fandom can unite total strangers to do something unexpectedly amazing and even kind. For episode 100, I want to talk about the healing powers of passion, fandom, and the sincere pumpkin patch, and how sometimes even horror stories can have happy endings. So what do I consider a sincere pumpkin patch? You can see these sincere pumpkin patches on the old state highways of America. They are roadside attractions, Civil War collection museums, reptile lands, papier-mâché recreations of children's fairy tales, Cadillac graveyards, and even castles made of beer bottles. Roadside America is the fertile crescent of sincere pumpkin patches. It is the most fucked up field of dreams you can imagine. But the greatest of all the roadside attractions is the one that is a gathering place at the edge of town, at the mouth of the woods. People come there to sit around the modern version of the campfire to share the ancient ritual of scary stories. Sometimes that ritual goes all night. Weather permitting, that is. I'm talking about the drive-in theater. And it is the bizarre circumstances surrounding a drive-in near where I grew up that gave me the theme to my 100th episode. It's the story of fandom and faith, hillbillies and horror movies, and passion and serendipity, a little bit of bad luck, and some unexpected generosity. It's a story that came to a head on July 15th, 2021 in Lehighton, Pennsylvania. And I'm so glad I was lucky enough to be there when it all went down. At the drive-in. Now, drive-ins are about as American of an institution as you can get. Even though we think of them at their height of popularity in the 1950s, the drive-in has been around as long as the automobile. And that history is part of the wonderful independent tradition of barnstorming that drives the American entertainment industry. In the beginning, there were silent movie palaces in the downtowns in the center of every city. It was assumed the movie theater was where you would go for entertainment, so you'd get on the trolley and you'd head downtown. The movie palace was built to be a permanent attraction. But as the cities continued to expand and grow, the folks who lived on the edge of town needed their own entertainment. Now, there were already temporary attractions that may have played into the evolution of what later became the drive-in. There were things like county fairs that were attractions that could be built quickly and then dismantled to move on 2 weeks later. And then there were the independent filmmakers who couldn't get their films shown in the studio-owned movie theaters downtown. These filmmakers took their movies on a road show. They pitched tents at the edge of town and they showed their scandalous films. Folks would drive out to see the movie, and then filmmakers would pack up before the local sheriff showed up. Experiments for how to combine the American passions of both the automobile and the movies started early on. In 1915, the Theater de Guadalupe in Las Cruces, New Mexico, opened a portion of their auditorium to allow automobiles to park, and in doing so, they created the first partial drive-in. In the 1920s, outdoor movies, where people would nail screens to trees in their backyard, were popular in the summer, but only a few of them tried to cater to the automobile because of logistics, like screen size and where the hell are you going to park all the cars. In the 1930s, the projector technology was there, but there weren't enough people with cars to grow the business. That all changes after World War II when people are able to buy cars and buy houses in the suburbs. The drive-in became a simple solution to a problem of necessity. You could build a movie palace on the outskirts of town, but it will take time and it will take a lot of money. But the drive-in screen and the land around it can be erected in a matter of days and be much cheaper. Suburbanites realized they could go to the movies in their car, and the movies were closer to where they lived. And the drive-in phenomenon was born. Now, I mentioned in previous episodes of this show about how phenomena are created unintentionally. Usually they're a byproduct of necessity. So comic books were the byproduct of newspapers trying to repackage their old funny pages. The New York punk scene started when downtown was abandoned and the art students played music at CBGB's just to get free rent. And creature features and horror hosts were the byproduct of studio bankruptcies and at the same time dead air on local affiliate TV stations, and they worked together. Even though movie theaters and drive-ins are essentially in the same business, they are as different as a church service and a tent revival. In movie theaters, you're expected to maintain a level of solemn decorum. Drive-ins are much more socially interactive, where you are allowed to shout at the pulpit and call back at the minister. The crazy style and the party atmosphere that we associate with drive-in movies came out of unique circumstances as well. Now, most people aren't aware of this fact, but the majority of movie tickets sold in the 1950s were bought by teenagers. Television was growing in popularity in the households, and the World War II generation parents were happy to just stay home. However, the teenagers, they wanted to get out of the house. They wanted to hang with their friends and have a party in a reasonably cozy, semi-private space. And that becomes a party in the car at the drive-in. It takes a lot of effort to disturb other patrons when you are inside a car, and so teenagers took full advantage of how hard that was, and they still were able to do it. So if a vast majority of the people who are going to be buying movie tickets are teenagers, you show them what you want to see, right? Only makes sense. So drive-in owners had to ask themselves this question: what kind of movies will attract teenagers? And that is how the drive-in became associated with horror movies and science fiction monsters and juvenile delinquent films. It is worth noting that most of these movies were being made by men in their 40s who are trying to figure out what the hell teenagers want. In the 50s, we start to see teenage life, the first teenagers, through the lens of middle-aged men, which I guess explains those beach blanket bingo movies with Frankie and Annette. But when I was growing up in the 1970s, a drive-in was where you got to see horror movies that just would not ever play in regular theaters. Joe Dante's Piranha, The Incredible Melting Man, William Castle's Bug, The Giant Spider Invasion, and yes, I understand they were just Volkswagens with spider legs, but they got under my skin. Yes, I was in hog heaven getting soaked, inundated in indie horror movies. I have always been a fan of the drive-in, even though the ones I grew up with have been long gone. My family didn't have a lot of money, so we went to the drive-in to watch second-run movies for $2 a carload. I grew up in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, and we had 5 drive-ins in the area. There was a Popular drive-in, and the Hazleton drive-in, which was next to the amusement park at the edge of town. And there was the Laurel drive-in, where my family waited in a mile-long line in the heat of August to see Star Wars. I still remember the poor teenager dressed as a stormtrooper on the side of the road trying not to faint. And then there was the Motor View, which had the balls to show the Texas Chainsaw Massacre on an 80-foot screen for a weekend. My dad was so angry that he couldn't drive to that side of town because he was afraid I'd see a massacre and I'd be scarred for life. And then there was the Valley Drive-In, which had a public swimming pool out in front of the giant screen. Like the old Carney days, everyone needed a gimmick. Now, my favorite gimmick, my favorite night at the drive-in was the dusk to dawn show. We would watch 5 or 6 movies all night until the sun came up. Dusk to dawn shows were a mixed bag of 1 or 2 big-name movies and then some really crazy horror movies in between. I know I saw some stuff I shouldn't have seen right around 2 o'clock in the morning. But for me, the movies were always only part of the drive-in experience. As a kid, I could get up and I could leave the car and I could walk between all the other vehicles until I got to the refreshment stand. And connected to the refreshment stand was the projector room. I could hear the sound of the film whizzing through the sprockets on the huge movie projector. If you were in the refreshment stand or even inside the bathroom, you could still hear the movie echoing through the night. In a drive-in, you almost feel like you were inside a giant projector, part of the movie machinery itself. The square windows in the cinder block wall of the projection booth were so close I could reach up and touch them. A shaft of multicolored light shot out of that window over my head and traveled 50 yards or more to land on the huge screen, and above that screen was a sky full of stars. This was different than a movie theater, which are made to be in total service of the experience of watching the motion picture magic happen. You sat in rows of seats in a room made for a silent audience. The projection room was far in the back, up on top of the auditorium, way up high, so the projector couldn't be heard. At the drive-in, on the other hand, there was no separating the movie from the experience. Once you bought a ticket and you entered the property, you became part of the show. Of course, my childhood and my teenage years were the last hurrah of the popularity of the drive-in. Movies like Jaws and Star Wars were blockbuster hits, and movie theaters started being replaced by multi-screen cineplexes. And Hollywood was making big-budget versions of the same types of movies that used to only be able to play in drive-ins. Soon, drive-ins were competing head-to-head with cinemas by showing the same first-run movies. And with cinemas, you got air conditioning, THX sound systems, and you could still go to the movies if it was pouring rain, so it really was no contest at all. In the 1950s, there were over 4,000 drive-in theaters in America. As of 2021, there are less than 300. So you're probably realizing that owning a drive-in is not a solid business investment. Chances for getting a bank loan for your drive-in are about the same as getting one for your podcast. Just saying. But as I said before, following your passion has very little to do with logic. And that brings me to the story of 3 Pennsylvania guys who decided to save an old drive-in outside of Lehighton, Pennsylvania. With the help of a ragtag group of film-loving volunteers, they bucked conventional wisdom and pledged their love to 35mm film forever. They found a way to go old school without feeling old school, and their infectious enthusiasm reinvigorated the drive-in culture. This is a story about obsession. This is a story about the crazy things we do for love. Like most of my stories, this one starts with a motion picture. Like most of you, I endured a large portion of the 2020 quarantine by binge-watching streaming movies. I was watching documentaries en masse when one called At the Drive-In, directed by Alexander Manelli, came up as a choice. I assumed it was a documentary about the history of drive-in theaters, and I figured that would be a fun watch. Little did I know I was about to be thrust into a story that I'd be obsessed with for over a year. I get 2 surprises immediately from this documentary. The first surprise is that it isn't a documentary about drive-in history. This is a contemporary story about one specific drive-in. The second surprise is that I know exactly where this drive-in is. This movie chronicles the ongoing saga of the Mahoning Drive-In, which opened in 1949, not a half hour from where I grew up. To be honest, I didn't go to the Mahoning Drive-In when I was a kid because we had our own drive-ins in town. And to be even more honest, by the time I was a teenager, there was nothing cool about the Mahoning Drive-In. Like most drive-ins, by the 1980s, the Mahoning limped along as attendance dropped and their movie season was ever shortening. The Mahoning itself was put on auction a few times over the decades, and it had multiple changes in ownership. It is true that the Mahoning has been in continuous operation since 1949, but there were years, like 1998, that it was only open for a few days as a legal requirement to keep the health permits valid. It got so bad, the owner threatened to show porn films to generate revenue to pay back taxes, but he ran afoul of the district attorney. There were discussions about turning the Mahoning into a 3-screen drive-in circle and other desperate measures during the 1990s. As one would expect, the owners and the managers jumped at any opportunity to help keep the business going. And in 2013, it nearly cost them the entire game when an investor from Florida agreed to lease and then buy the theater. Folks from across the area volunteered their time to paint and repair and clean up the drive-in so it could open on schedule. The problem was that the whole thing was a scheme. When the investor missed his first lease payment, an investigation showed that he had done the same thing in 3 different states, under 3 different aliases. The Mahoning's finances took a big hit over this scheme, but they had even worse news coming from Hollywood. The studios announced that they were going to stop making 35mm prints for any new films and go fully digital. This forced old theaters like the Mahoning to either buy a $50,000 digital projector or slowly get phased out of existence. For about the 100th time, things looked bleak for the Mahoning Drive-In. However, in 2014, the drive-in's luck was about to change. Well, sort of. Jeff Maddox, the long-standing film projectionist at the drive-in, became the new owner of the Mahoning. He became the owner of the drive-in, but not the land itself. He leases the land. We will be coming back to this. What Jeff brought to the drive-in was not a strong business model or a strong marketing acumen. What Jeff brought was a true believer's zeal for the wonder and power of film and the ritual of cinema. The ritual of film itself. Film, with its tangible weight, its tactile magic, and the mesmerizing poetry of the dance between man and machine. A physical dance that could prove dangerous with the whirring gears and the white-hot lights. Jeff had been a projectionist in the Air Force back in 1978, and he has been a professional projectionist ever since. So his devotion to cinema, and especially the 35mm film, is cultivated by a lifetime of holding the print stock in his hands to inspect it, and cleaning the projectors, and intuitively knowing the size of the film loop that's needed for the sound to keep sync. He's like the monk who devotes his life to protect a sacred object. When I saw Jeff in that documentary, I fell in love with him because I understood him. As a writer, I wrestle with smoke. As a projectionist, Jeff wrestles with light. It is namaskar. The crazy in me recognizes and honors the crazy in Jeff. And you know what? Quite honestly, that madman zeal is the only thing that could have saved the Mahoning Drive-In. Let's face it, there's not some great economic secret that anyone was going to bring to a 72-year-old drive-in to make it profitable. There was no insider scoop or industry standard or $50,000 magic lantern that was going to bring crowds consistently to Lehighton. The only thing that could do that, the only thing Jeff Maddox could do, was make the most sincere pumpkin patch he could, and then see who would be drawn to it to bring their own magic. Now, what I find fascinating in stories like this, where passion is the driving force, is how often serendipity is involved. One of the things that is very unique about the Mahoning Drive-In is that it never went through any major renovations over 72 years. You know, in order to keep up with the times and the technology, most drive-ins did massive retooling many times over, hoping to draw more crowds as the decades went by. They followed the trends. They changed their buildings, their snack bars, and most importantly, their film projectors. The Mahoning Drive-In, on the other hand, has never had any major renovations, and it is nearly the same as it was in 1949. Now, probably the reason is because the Mahoning itself has never had the revenue during the renovation years to be able to do it in the first place. Plus, I know the area, and there's a very strong, if it ain't broke, don't fix it vibe that borders on neglect. But for whatever reason, the fact that it still had the original movie projectors from 1948 sealed Jeff's fate forever. The dual projectors are ICP Simplex E7s, built in Bloomfield, New Jersey in 1948, and they have been running for 72 years. They are heavy equipment, they are heavy metal, and they are gorgeous to behold. However, The retention of the original projectors and the traditional drive-in layout were not the only serendipity that occurred. In July of 2014, Jeff decided to make the hard decision to abandon the digital projector route and stay the course with 35mm. This is big. This meant that any new films and any movies made after that point would not be available for him to show. His decision was in direct opposition to where the industry pointed, and it cut off a huge avenue for potential revenue. Jeff's film booking agent abandoned him, and the Mahoning Drive-In was relegated to the designation of retro theater. So, you see, Jeff followed his passion. And this is where the story can either go in the direction of Tucker, the man in his dream, or go in the direction of Aguirre, the wrath of God. The first season after the change, it looked like Jeff would end up on a raft alone floating down the Amazon covered with monkeys. The Mahoning lost money, and there were more than a few nights where only 4 cars showed up. And even though 4 ticket sales wouldn't cover the price of the electrical bill for that night, Jeff played the movie anyway. Because that's what devotees of cinema do. And that is when a serendipitous traffic jam brought 2 Temple University students into the story, and they changed everything. Again. The story goes that Matt McClanahan was stopped in traffic on a Pennsylvania highway, and he made a detour down Route 443. Now, although the Mahoning is not on 443, its retro marquee with a huge curved red arrow pointing the way is. McClanahan saw it, stopped, and called his college friend Virgil Cardamone. Matt thought he had found an old abandoned drive-in until Jeff drove by on his way to work there. And just like that, Jeff invited Matt to tour the projection room. Matt is a fellow film lover as well as a low-budget horror filmmaker with a borderline obsessive DIY streak. And he could not believe what Jeff just showed him. Not only were the Simplex EX7s there, but the Mahoning boasts a 120-foot wide CinemaScope screen, the biggest in Pennsylvania and the second largest in the country. As the old saying goes, every pitney needs his bows, and Jeff, Matt, and Virgil realized this could be the start of a beautiful friendship. And in 2015, Jeff made Virgil and Matt official business partners. Coupling Jeff's knowledge and his technical prowess and his fearlessness with Virgil and Matt's creativity and their marketing savvy and their limitless energy and enthusiasm, the trio began a quest to transform a failing retro theater into a weekly celebration of movies and, even more importantly, a celebration of the movie lovers who love them. They needed to create something that would not only draw an audience, but also attract a specific, die-hard, dedicated group. Whether they consciously knew it or not, they needed to hook film enthusiasts and the film geek fandom that goes along with it. Now here's where I want to get something off my chest. I saw a lot of stories about the Mahoning, including a New York Times article that said it was saved by the nostalgia craze. You know, to me, that is such a simplistic and lazy reading of what really happened there, and it discounts the smart choices that were made. The Mahoning Drive-In was not saved by nostalgia. Nostalgia is a group of people who want a specific thing from a very specific time period, and that group shrinks over time. Nostalgia is a memory trapped in amber. It is beautiful to the beholder, but there are no surprises or changes ever, and if you do not change, you die. Do you want to know what nostalgia gets you? Nostalgia gets you that first season where Jeff reverted to a retro drive-in and they only sold 4 tickets and operated at a loss. Sooner or later, that's what nostalgia gets you. The Mahoning was not saved by catering to a few people that chase personal memories of a time that's long gone. Nostalgia didn't save the Mahoning Drive-In. Fandom did. Virgil Cardamone and Matt McClanahan had a golden opportunity to draw in the film enthusiasts and the film geeks, because they are film enthusiasts and film geeks themselves. They knew that film geeks have an insatiable love for the universe of movies. That includes watching movies. and reading about movies and talking about movies and researching other movies. We are completists who are overjoyed that we will never complete the task of seeing everything, but we will die trying and we'll die with a smile on our face. We are prone to cinematic crushes, and all a filmmaker ever needs to do is excite us once, and we're in love with them for life. We love to play in the celluloid sandbox, and we love sharing the experience with other maniacs. And we will travel to do it, ladies and gentlemen. Film geeks and enthusiasts will drive 100 miles to see the BFI cut of Ken Russell's The Devils, or the director's cut of The Wild Bunch, or a Wings Hauser triple feature. We love it all. We want it all. Keep coming with all of this stuff. Fandom celebrates the retro by seeing it in new ways, loving it for what it is now, not as a dusty memory of the past. Nostalgia fades, but fandom is forever. A great reason for their success in cultivating film enthusiasts and film geeks is knowing what they were sitting on and promoting that. Virgil became the new film booking agent, and he advertised that they had a huge CinemaScope screen and they showed 35mm prints exclusively. See, another thing about film enthusiasts and geeks is that we love the technology and how there's both art and science involved in film. We want to see the best version of a film possible, as close to the filmmaker's original vision as possible. We take seeing to a whole new weird level of commitment. Collectors and filmmakers themselves dream to have their own films or the prints from their collections projected that way. To see a CinemaScope projection of their movies, oh my goodness, that brings people. Quentin Tarantino did not send his private collection print of Kevin Smith's Clerks to the Mahoning purely out of nostalgia. But the smartest move that Team Mahoning did was that they not only curated the films, but they also curated the fan experience. Virgil is the brains behind the film festival-style programming, the themed double features, and the director retrospectives. And the Mahoning folk are aware that, of all the film geeks, horror film geeks are the ones who keep coming back for more. Horror is by far the biggest draw at drive-ins, and the choices for films and themes that Virgil makes are fun and eclectic. Here are some curations from the 2020 season. It's a Mad Max weekend, where they showed all 4 of the George Miller classics. The Real Weird Weekend 2020, where they teamed up with Exhumed Films to show Street Trash and Buckaroo Banzai. And then there was Drive-In Zombie Fest 4, a 3-day zombie extravaganza. And this is a sign of the clever movie curation. Out of the 9 films over those 3 days, the only Romero zombie film is Day of the Dead, the really weird one. The other choices expand the casual horror fan's definition of the zombie film, with Shivers, Sugar Hill, Frankenhooker, Return of the Living Dead, Reanimator, and The Last Night is entirely dedicated to Maniac Cop 1, 2, and 3. When you cater to film geeks, especially horror film geeks, it means you're going to get a lot of colorful characters, and people show up in costumes and get into the party atmosphere of the night. When folks let their freak flag fly, the Mahoning staff don't try to stifle that, they just let them be part of the party. But then, there are those fans who fall in love with the drive-in, and they realize they can't just be bystanders. They're compelled to join. They're compelled to contribute or create in some way. And those people become Mahoning Drive-In Family. Mahoning Family starts with Jessica Pell, who is the longest tenured person at the Mahoning, other than Jeff Maddox, who hired her. Jessica was there during the hardest times for the Mahoning, and she is now the senior manager and the warm heart of the drive-in. But after Jessica, the rest of the cast is a band of ragtag refugees who band together to make movie magic. Now, when you watch the documentary at the drive-in, and I do strongly suggest that you do, you are struck by just how many folks volunteer their time and effort just because they want to be there and be part of this fun thing, this special thing. There are a lot of people who volunteer their time and skills for free, But before you cry foul, I think it's important to point out, only in the last few years did the drive-in become successful enough for Matt and Virgil to become paid employees. Basically, they were doing it for love all those years. And once again, when you follow your passion, sometimes it's crazy when you realize what you will do for love. Now, there are local people who love low-budget horror movies, and they will volunteer to run the ticket booth just to be there. And then there is Robert Humanic, who started out as a patron with an insanely large encyclopedic knowledge and love for films, who would come almost every weekend, and he would talk non-stop to anyone who would listen to him about films and cinema. And what did that get him? Well, he's now become the assistant projectionist at the Mahoning. And then there is J.T. Mills, a patron who started showing up at the drive-in dressed in costumes that were themed to the movies. He started dressing and creating props back in 2015, and he walks among the rest of the patrons in character during the films. He takes the movies off the screen and single-handedly turns the entire drive-in into a fun, interactive experience. As JT says, "If I share this stuff I have, all these props, it means I'm not a hoarder if I share it, right? It's sad if they're just in my garage." I wish I didn't know what he was talking about. Every weekend, people travel from New Jersey and Maryland and New York to come see the movies at the Mahoning. But what if I were to tell you that every weekend, people come from other states to come and volunteer at the Mahoning? There are people like Corey Pace, the snack bar cook who lives just far enough that he sleeps over the weekend in the back room. There is Harry Guerro, a New Jersey film collector who loans feature films, shorts, and trailers from his collection. Not only that, he suggested and supplied films for Zombie Fest, all as a volunteer, while running his own repertory cinema company, Exhumed Films. Why does he do it? Because he wants people who are real movie lovers, like-minded people, to experience the movies that he loves, and he has found that the Mahoning is the gathering place for people like that. And then there are John and Cindy Demmer. They drive in from New Jersey with elaborate sets and costumes they created for the Mahoning to use for celebrity photo shoots. John's a professional carpenter, and he builds these things because he wanted to be part of the entertainment. They didn't drive all that way to sit in a car. They jump into the party atmosphere and the camaraderie by sharing in the creation. And there's Mark Nelson, who started volunteering at the drive-in back in 2015, who would drive from, wait for it, he would drive from Keene, New Hampshire, to be part of the wild, weird, and wonderful world of the drive-in. In case you were wondering, that's a 6.5-hour drive. And he did this to run the register at the snack bar for fucking free. However, since then, Mark has been hired as the theater manager, and his commute has shortened to a mere 2.5 hours. Now here's the kicker. When Mark lived in Keene, he was only 45 minutes away from his local drive-in. But it was the Mahoning that he visited in particular that called to him. As he says, it is truly a love of film. The customers were just as crazy for films as the people who were working there. Now, if this were a horror movie, about now would be the time the hero would discover that this land holds an ancient curse on it. There must be bones of an angry spirit buried deep underneath the drive-in, which makes everyone behave so strangely. But you know what? It's none of that. It's just the overwhelming pull of sharing something you love with people who get it. I feel that at my horror conventions with my horror family. All of these people, they make a weekend pilgrimage, and as they get closer to their sacred place, they transform into someone else or something else. That's the power and the draw of finding your personal, most sincere pumpkin patch. And that's what I was missing all through 2020, the ability to jump into the crazy ceremony of congregating with fellow freaks. So it should come as no surprise that I'd reach out to the folks at the Mahoning and make the pilgrimage myself. After some conversations with Mark Nelson, the one-time Road Warrior snack bar attendant who is now the theater manager, it was decided that I would come visit the theater and meet everyone in the summer of 2021. After COVID lockdown, I needed to head back to see family as well, so there's a small window of availability. Arbitrarily, I decided upon the weekend of July 16th to the 18th for a visit to the Mahoning. Little did I know that I picked the weekend that would not only be the biggest event in the history of the drive-in, but it would also be a weekend that would change their fortunes in the craziest ways possible. It all started with a special guest. I was introduced to Joe Bob Briggs back in the 1980s when he had his drive-in theater show on the Movie Channel. I immediately took to his style. It was an obvious parody of a good old boy who proudly loved B-movies most critics would just ignore. But what I really enjoyed was that it was obvious that he was smart, that he got both the joy and the silliness of genre films, and he was a film enthusiast. I also loved his serious acting role in Heidi Honeycutt's short horror film Wretched under his alter ego John Bloom. Joe Bob Briggs has had a long career with its ups and its downs. In the 2000s, his notoriety may have faded along with the drive-in as YouTube and streaming services made B-movies easier to find and watch, and there were basements full of imitators that choked the internet. But just like the drive-in, Joe Bob's appeal never died. Recently, Joe Bob has made a wildly impressive comeback. A few years ago, I saw his traveling one-man show, How Rednecks Saved Hollywood in Los Angeles, and I knew he was onto something. Shortly after that, Shudder, the streaming horror channel, premiered the series The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs. It premiered on July 13, 2018 as a live-streaming 13-movie marathon. And guess what happened? The drive-in movie scholar with the cowboy hat and the sharp wit broke the internet. His show received critical raves, and Joe Bob Briggs is currently in the midst of a very strong pop culture resurgence. So it was no small news for me to hear that Joe Bob Briggs would be doing a 4-night jamboree at the Mahoning Drive-In. And it would happen over the course of my visit. During his event, he would do his How Rednecks Saved Hollywood. He would tape a live episode of his Shudder series, and he would show what he considers the greatest movie ever made, Smokey and the Bandit. And the jamboree would end with a double feature horror show on the last night, which would be the night I came to visit. By the way, the double feature was Vincent Price and Andre Dutoth's House of Wax and James Arness in the masterpiece Them. Now, the Mahoning getting this commitment from Joe Bob was huge. And to top it off, the New York Times even wrote an article about the Mahoning. Everything was going right. The turnaround of fortunes for the drive-in from July 2014 to July 2021 was amazing. And it seemed like nothing could stop the Mahoning now. Remember back when I mentioned that Jeff Maddox bought and owned the drive-in theater in 2014, but he only leased the land? Yeah, I said we'd come back to that. So before I go deep into this, I think it's important to say that when you talk about pop art business, and drive-ins in particular, that being a success is a very relative term. By July of 2021, the Mahoning Drive-In had become successful as a drive-in. In other words, they have a reputation that gives them first-name basis relationships with studio agents and the distributors. They can book live events from Tromathon with Lloyd Kaufman and found footage festivals with folks from the Colbert Report. And they have a devoted following, so the drive-in is profitable, and they have enough to pay employees who used to work for free. But that doesn't mean they're going to buy Paramount anytime soon. I've heard from a few folks who run other drive-ins that are still successful that you don't buy a drive-in to get rich. You go into it because you love movies. So even though the New York Times writes an article about the drive-in, it doesn't mean that they have no financial worries. When a windstorm damaged the CinemaScope screen, a GoFundMe page was started to help get it fixed. In 2018, when their iconic marquee sign needed repairs, the fans came out to help fund that. The point is, even when things seem to be chugging along, something unexpected can derail you. And that brings me back to a few lines that are spoken by Jeff Maddox in the documentary At the Drive-In. He says, "I lease the property, I do not own the property. Boy, I wish I did. I hope that's coming someday. I own the business, but the property is still owned by the guy who's had it for decades. Every so often, someone offers to buy the place and they want to take it out from under us, but fortunately, the landowner, he won't sell it. He will not sell it." So as soon as I heard those words in the documentary, I was thinking, wow, this is Anton Chekhov's gun, man. That is some foreboding level of foreshadowing. That rifle is going to go off in the second or third act. So what was the third act? On July 13th, days before the huge Joe Bob Briggs event, Virgil Cardamone released a video on the Mahoning website. He said the land that the Mahoning Drive-In was on had been sold to Green Skies Clean Energy LLC, a solar company in Connecticut. The company had optioned the land and was going to tear down the drive-in and put in a solar farm. You might be asking yourself, how does something like this happen? Well, it seemed the Mahoning was going to be a victim of something that has taken out many a drive-in before. The Mahoning was going to be a casualty of a taxpayer business agreement. What is a taxpayer business agreement, you may ask? Well, a taxpayer business is a practice that started when cities began growing rapidly, that whole area of urban sprawl. If you were someone who had a little extra money to invest in a long-term business venture, you'd pick up some land outside of the city limits, far enough away to get a good price to buy. You do this on the belief that the urban sprawl would eventually reach the land you own, and then you can sell it at a really nice profit. The idea is that you are in it for the long haul, for the biggest payday. And in the meantime, you lease the land so you can make enough money to pay the taxes on it. A lot of drive-in theaters and diners were designed primarily as taxpayer businesses. Most of the time, these things become handshake agreements. There's not a tremendous amount of money being made or lost. Take the Mahoning. The owner of the land doesn't care about movies and he stays out of the day-to-day business. And the manager of the drive-in isn't interested in the larger business concerns outside of what affects the drive-in proper. But you know what? These agreements that sound really good, they tend to be very unofficial. Now, being at the edge of the Poconos, I'm sure Lehighton businessmen probably saw how urban sprawl transformed little villages like Jim Thorpe into really great tourist attractions. But the same development didn't happen there in Lehighton. And probably, after a few decades, the owner decided it was time to retire and take a deal. If the Mahoning was dealing with handshake agreements and land options that were already made, things looked pretty bleak. It was confusing. I mean, the Mahoning was doing strong business, and it was a marketing success. So why kill it now? Although Virgil was obviously very shaken in the video, he did start a rallying cry, a call out for a possible Hail Mary pass from fans. If there was enough support for the drive-in at an upcoming zoning meeting, Green Skies might agree to let their option lapse. And that would give the Mahoning folks a chance to buy the land themselves, but that's not a big chance. However, the message to us was clear. It was time for the film geek fandom to step up and be heard. Virgil asked us to send letters, attend the hearing if possible, and share the video, and to tag any posts about this with #SaveTheMahoning. I was traveling to Pennsylvania when the news came over social media, and I scrambled to put a post out with the video. Seconds after I saw the first video post, I saw a tweet from Joe Bob Briggs. It read, "Have you tearful, defeated Mahoning lovers already forgotten how I sign off every show? Join me Thursday night for the kickoff of Joe Bob's Drive-In Jamboree at the Mahoning. We have plans. We don't lose. #SaveTheMahoning." It was inspiring to see that post, and I saw a few other posts start to trickle in right after that. And then there were a few more. And then there were a few more. And then there was a deluge. Not only did the local Pocono fans activate, but also folks across the nation started posting and writing letters to Green Skies LLC. Virgil and Mark were inundated with phone interviews and on-camera interviews from people around the globe. People who had never been to the drive-in but saw the documentary sent their support. Vocal members of the horror community across the country who only knew of the Mahoning by reputation still gave their support. Businesses chimed in, stating how the Mahoning events helped put cash into the local economy. Within 24 hours of the first posting of the video, it was all over. Upon seeing the outpouring from the community, Green Skies suspended any and all plans for the facility at that site. Not only that, Green Skies negotiated a discussion between the owner of the land and the Mahoning folks so Jeff and company could buy the land outright. When Green Skies issued a statement, here is what they said. Green Skies Solar suspends plans for the solar facility at the Mahoning Drive-In site. The outpouring of support from the local community and the cinephiles near and far has demonstrated the unique value the Mahoning Drive-In represents. Green Skies Solar is proud to have played a part in helping preserve a celebrated business like the Mahoning Drive-In Theater. So, a couple things about this. First thing, companies and businesses don't back off on business ventures as soon as someone has a dispute with it. It is expected that there will be some disputes over property, and that is why there are hearings. That is why there are lawyers. In all honesty, most companies don't even respond until they are absolutely positively forced to. A public statement within 24 hours over a drive-in lot? That's unheard of. Second thing, this response from the company, their written statement, wasn't angry or even neutral in tone. It was positive. It was inclusive. It was passionate. This company, at least publicly, responded to the overwhelming passion and love coming from ordinary people. Not only did they recognize passion when they saw it, but when they understood the context of the situation, they decided not only to remove themselves from the conflict, but they also offered to help fix the problem. This is like when the folks who come to arrest George Bailey decide to toss a few dollars into the hat instead. It is corny. It is unbelievable until it actually happens. And you know what happened after that? The film geeks and the drive-in fans thanked Green Skies LLC publicly, online. The very social media that they used to rally support against Green Skies was immediately used to thank them for the decision. Thank you for seeing the whole picture. And they thanked them personally for being good people and sharing that sentiment with as many people on the internet that they could. You know, it's like a Twilight Zone episode. Imagine a world where strangers band together online to use social media as a tool to do good. A world where corporations put the interest of a community ahead of their own because it's the fair and right thing to do. This isn't the Twilight Zone. It's Lehighton, Pennsylvania on July 15th, 2021. What the hell just happened? Quite simply, my friends, it was Namaskray. Everyone recognized and honored the crazy in each other. So I could go on in this episode and discuss everything that happened during my amazing night at the Mahoning Theater. And it was amazing. And there are so many great people I met that I want to talk about that deserve to be talked about. And the party atmosphere there was joyful. But you know what? Sometimes the story tells the writer when it's time to end. My night under the stars with my brethren and the magic that I felt at the drive-in, well, I'll tell that tale very soon. But it wouldn't feel right to tell it here. It would feel like the last 30 minutes of Return of the King if I tacked it on here, or the Ewok celebration, Return of the Jedi. You know, every story has its reason to be. And this story has its reason to be. So, to the creators, and the dreamers, and the lovers, the hardcore fans of genre movies, I ask you, why do we do what we do? What we do sounds crazy to everyone except us. Because you know what? Following our passion has very little to do with logic. We need to surrender to that excitement, that devotion. That devotion comes from something deeper and something more personal. Passion doesn't have prestige, and it isn't about pedigree, and it may never bring you wealth, but it will bring you riches. When we share a piece of ourselves that is not ordinary, a piece of ourselves that is strange and rare and unique, when we choose this path, we freely admit to what we really care about, and with that we are compelled to share that with each other. The real joy comes from the act of sharing that love. When we share the thing that we create out of passion, we connect with other people in a deep and personal way. So in the end, when all is said and done, why do I do this? Well, hell, I did this for love. And I think you did too. Stay hellbent. Hi, I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do.